thank you to everyone who is here at this very important panel. I've been very much looking forward to this, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to moderate this panel, to have the privilege of being with all of you, and especially with our three MPs, our three parliamentarians who have very kindly are joining us to discuss the state of, the features of, the future of Canadian parliamentary democracy. And so with that, we're going to be talking about a number of different subjects. It's going to be a very open-ended discussion, given that we are talking about the future of Canadian parliamentary democracy. There's no question that in the last number of years, even before COVID, our democracy has come under stress, has had some pressures placed upon it. There have been controversies that have arisen about the obligation of Parliament more recently to meet and consider legislation, especially, of course, in times of emergencies such as COVID-19. But, there's a lot we can talk about. Prior to this panel, I was thinking about some of the topics we might get to, and this is just the beginning of a list, and we can go in many different directions. It could be, of course, the functioning of Parliament during COVID-19, the role and value of question period even before COVID-19, the future of our electoral system, the role of MPs, the free votes, party discipline in Parliament, cultivating an engaged electorate, the lawmaking role of MPs and how that relates to the rule of law and the Constitution, collegiality, collaboration among MPs across party lines, and myths or conventional wisdom about our Parliament, about parliamentarians that might actually not hold all that much water. That's just a tip of the iceberg. But before we get started, I'm very, very pleased to introduce our three MPs who are joining us today. First, starting with Stephanie Kusie, the Member of Parliament for Calgary, Vindemor. Stephanie was born and raised in the community of the riding she represents, Calgary, Vindemor. She studied at the University of Calgary. She earned a degree in political science there. She then went on to obtain her master's in business administration in strategic management from Rutgers University. She worked as a diplomat for the Canadian federal government from 2004 to 2013, and she was elected as an MP in 2017. In September of 2018, she took over the position of Official Opposition Shadow Minister for Democratic Institutions. And following the fall 2019 general election, she served as the Shadow Minister for Families, Children, and Social Development, a role she held until last September when she was appointed as Shadow Minister for Transport. Stephanie speaks English, French, and Spanish fluently. She enjoys traveling and spending time with her husband, James, and their son, Edward. Next, we have Nathaniel Erksine-Smith, the Member of Parliament for Beaches, East York. And Nathaniel is a Liberal MP for that riding. He's held that riding since 2015. And prior to becoming a Member of Parliament, he was a commercial litigation lawyer and had some volunteer civil liberties legal work that he did as well. And he's someone who takes greater independence in political representation seriously. Finally, Elizabeth May, the Member of Parliament for Saanich, Gulf Islands. Elizabeth is the Green Party of Canada's first elected MP, representing Saanich Gulf Islands in Vancouver Island. In 2005, Elizabeth was made an Officer of the Order of Canada in recognition of her decades of leadership in the Canadian environmental movement. Elizabeth is the author of 8 books, including her most recent, Who We Are, Reflections on My Life and on Canada. In November of 2019, she stepped down as the leader of the Green Party after serving in that role for 13 years, but continues as parliamentary leader for Canada's first federal Green Party caucus. So I'm very, very pleased to have our three MPs with us. Thank you so much for joining us. And the way we're going to start is each MP is going to speak for 5 to 7 minutes on the theme of this evening from the perspective they'd like to take it in, the direction they'd like to take it in. And then after that, we're going to have discussion amongst them, moderated by me, and then we'll finally get to the Q&A. So as Mark mentioned, please, as you're listening to them speak, don't hesitate to put in your questions into the Q&A box. And even though the chat is not being used for the Q&A, the chat is active. So if you feel you want to express yourself there, just to throw something out in the chat, that's fine as well. So with that, I'll hand it over to Stephanie to start us off with her opening remarks. Stephanie.
Well, thank you, Brian, so much for having me here today. And thank you very much to Runnymede for having me. It is a pleasure to be here, and it's fantastic to be here with my two colleagues. I guess I'm going first because I'm not as smart as Nate and I'm not as famous as Elizabeth, but they're both incredible individuals. Nate, thank you very much for recommending me for this. Nate and I actually were on the same floor in Justice on Parliament Hill. We've had the pleasure to have many informal discussions about democracy. So it's a pleasure to be with him. And Elizabeth and I have the pleasure of having done a lot of work in the realm of advancing women in politics. As she has kindly mentioned before, Elizabeth, you're so gracious in this regard. I am the former chair of the Alberta South chapter of Equal Voice. By the way, I'm going to do a plug for Daughters of the Vote coming up very quickly here. I would really advise you to check into that. Well, Brian, such an accomplished individual, Brian, it's so interesting to learn more about you. Did provide an overview as to my resume. It's really fascinating for me to be here today with a number of either lawyers or those who are legally minded. I did write the LSAT. I did horribly. I got 155. However, my right path did find itself when I did write the Foreign Service exam in 2002. I came in number one out of 8,000. And so I found my path, fortunately. And law, it wasn't, but foreign affairs, it was indeed. So it's definitely good to be here. So we're here today sort of bringing our positions on democracy here in Canada. And I'm even going to extend beyond that a little bit and go to the international scene, given that that's my passion. Now, I must admit, in the last 6 months, given that I am the shadow minister for transport, it's been more in the patron saint of airlines and airline workers. But really, my passion is foreign affairs, and my leader knows that, my colleague knows that, just given my background. But I come to here today to sort of tell you that after 4 years now, it'll be 4 years on April 3rd of this year that I replaced Jason Kenney, my predecessor in Calgary, Vindemor, that I've sat in the House of Commons, and I did have the I guess it's called a privilege, but it really was a torture of being the vice chair of the PROC committee in the House of Commons. And really what comes to mind of my entire experience is the Jean Chrétien biography, The Friendly Dictator. At the time, I thought, oh, that's kind of quaint. That's very interesting, but it's actually sort of very telling for how our democracy is run. And this is not limited to a certain party. I think this is across all parties. Perhaps, no offense, Elizabeth, Green isn't developed enough yet to be at that level of corruption yet, but don't worry, it'll get there in time as it grows. I have no doubt about that. But my experience really is that whoever has power will wield it for their advantage, and we see this on a daily basis. What comes to mind, in fact, Ryan, just yesterday, I look at C7, a bill, assisted dying, which was so very dear, certainly to many members of my caucus, and the Liberals went ahead, made a deal with the Bloc, and pushed for closure, which means no more discussion is going to happen on the bill. Now, some people argue, there was extensive discussion, et cetera, but there were Senate amendments which extended to those with mental disabilities, et cetera. A lot more discussion we felt had to be had, but this was an instance where the Liberal government was able to use closure and shut it down. But let me say, on PROC, I was there at the time when they were shepherding through Bill C-76, and this is when the Liberals had a majority, not a minority. I think they plucked Blake Richards, my colleague, who is the member for Banff Airdrie and now the whip of my party, and placed me there because they thought, Karina Gold, awesome lady, like spunky lady, let's put another youngish, spunky lady up next to her, Stephanie, we'll put her in there. But really it was very tough, because whenever you are in a majority situation, any government can really just put through whatever they want. So the types of things that we saw go through, which I thought really were against democracy. For example, there was a lot of discussion. Again, Nate and I have had lots of conversations about truly closing loopholes on foreign interference. I felt that Bill C-76 did not address that. Partisan spending for the pre-writ period, you get to the election time and there are certain amounts and limits that we have within the election period. But man, oh man, before that writ drops, Brian, it's just a free-for-all. Go crazy, go nuts, spend as much as you want. Voter identification card, that was another area where we, the Conservatives, had a lot of concern, where it was made an acceptable form of identification, again, which really felt like it was favoring the government at that time. Elections Canada was named to do outreach campaigns. We really felt felt that this isn't the role of government to go and push individuals to vote, that really it's the vote of political parties to motivate their base to get out and vote. As well, the Commissioner of Elections Canada placed under Elections Canada really seemed like a conflict of interest to us. That's within 76 itself, Brian. I'm not even getting to what was the most egregious to me, or I won't be able to get into it much. The Debates Commission. Guess who was a member of the Debates Commission, everyone? A Kielburger brother, okay? All right? I'm not going to get into it, but I'm just saying, that's sort of what we're looking at. So, this is my experience, and really, it was terrible. I was like the bull sent in a matador bull fight every single day, where literally my opposition house would give me, I want you to go in and say, and I knew when I get slaughtered and get defeated, but I had to go in and say it for the extra $6,000 you get a year as a vice chair. So I did it. But very disheartening, very discouraging. Now, as I said, my goal eventually is to go into a more international realm. It's no secret to anyone within my caucus. My dream is to be Minister of Foreign Affairs. No, not the Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, then maybe Canadian ambassador to US or Mexico. I'll take either. And then hopefully the head of a UN agency. And maybe I'd settle for not the Secretary General, but the second in command for the Organization of American States. So you got to aim big. I think that's very important. But my point is, I'm a big member of the Parliamentarians group, and they asked me recently to be one of the vice chairs of the Open Government, and I had a really hard time saying yes, although I did, and I'm not even really wholeheartedly committed because I do think we have a long way to. Or it's not true democracy here in Canada. Yeah, we have parties. Yeah, we go to the polls. But the party who gets in power really makes the calls. That's the end of it. I'm gonna finish by saying, because I know I'm coming up to 6:45 here, Brian. I mentioned all these other goals. My dream amongst all dreams would be to go to the United Nations as the Secretary General and make considerable reform there. There are all sorts of things, the unchecked powers of the nuclear countries, the members of the Human Rights Committee, accountability among UN officials in Kosovo, as we saw, and I could go on and on and on. So I think democracy, it's a great idea. We're not at a place anymore in the world. It's too complex where we hold up our donuts like they did in Greece or whatever, yes or no. It's way worse in a lot of countries, don't get me wrong, but my experience is that whoever's in power truly has a lot of power. The Great Reset or the global elites, whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of injustice in the world, and I don't even believe that it is that those who are advocating against it are truly just and truly subject to democracy itself. So at almost 8 minutes, Brian, I'm going to wrap up there. I'm looking forward to what my colleagues have to say. Thank you so much for having me. Elizabeth, I hope to see you in Ottawa sometime soon. Nate, we'll get together for a vegan mimosas. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Really appreciate you kicking us off that way, especially you could bring the international perspective. That's really valuable. Really appreciate that, given your background prior to becoming an MP. And as you mentioned, future aspirations as well. So that's great. I appreciate it. I'll hand it over immediately to Nathaniel Erksine-Smith to keep the party going.
That was a number of different directions where Stephanie went in, and I would say my future aspiration is really, if I can find a clean shirt tomorrow, I am in good shape. So I don't have grand aspirations as far as it goes. Although she says I'm smarter than Stephanie, although she speaks 3 languages and I'm lucky to speak one eloquently at times. So here goes. I think Stephanie's right when we look at international affairs and when we look at democracy around the world. I do think there's much to be done as it relates to democratic renewal. One likes to think, there's no steady progress. Usually it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I think it's been 1 step forward, 2 steps back in more recent times around the world. She's also right about rules-based reforms that we can make as it relates to strengthening our elections. Although I will say, once upon a time, I did my BCL at Oxford before coming back and practicing law, and I played baseball there. And not very many people play baseball when they go to the United Kingdom, but a few expats from Canada, and my catcher was from Mississippi and another pitcher was from Colorado, and they'd been involved in politics, supporting the Obama campaigns and in a volunteer capacity in some way. I said, oh yeah, when I get back to Canada, I'm interested in getting involved in politics. And we started talking about the money involved, and they laughed at me for a good 5 minutes when they found out that it would be $100,000 to run a campaign locally, that would be a one bad radio spot in in their campaigns. So I do think we're lucky, actually. So where I would disagree with Stephanie, I do think we have a pretty strong democracy. We have the rules that are in place are incredibly strong, and we are lucky to live in Canada as a result, as it relates to our democracy. We can look to rules-based reforms as it relates to electoral reform, and I think Elizabeth may well touch on electoral reform. I do think we ought to change some of those rules, because as Stephanie points out, that in our first past the post system, minority of voters tends to deliver a majority, and that tends to deliver 100% of the power, and that does distort. It does distort our democratically elected governments, that they believe at times they have a mandate that they don't truly have as it relates to a majority of Canadians. And we end up seeing, instead of more uneven progress, we see very quick progress that tends to become undone, and we get a seesaw effect as between typically liberal and conservative governments. But with the remainder of my time, I'm less interested actually in rules-based reform, and I'm more interested in cultural reforms. We can talk about changing QP, we can talk about changing all sorts of specific rules as it relates to Parliament, but I actually think that we can't always pull about culture and rules, that you make a rule change, that it can change the culture, but we can change the culture in and of itself. And I think when we think about loyalties, we ought to, when we think about the future of our parliamentary democracy in Canada, I hope we think differently about loyalties, and that we think differently about as it relates to loyalties to our constituents versus loyalties to right answers versus loyalties to our party versus loyalties to our country. And I personally think, when you look at what we've seen in the United States at times, and yes, in Canada, there's an unhealthy allegiance, I think, unhealthy centralization in our parties, but an unhealthy allegiance to our parties at times, where we are unwilling to disagree with party leadership, and we are unwilling to disagree with our parties, even respectfully, outside of caucus walls. And I think what that does, and I understand why, we hear all the time, politics is a team sport, and if we are seen to disagree, it's perceived as some kind of weakness in that sport. But I personally think it undermines people's trust in the overall system. That if they don't see us disagreeing with one another in a reasonable, respectful way, if they don't see us making it a politics of ideas, and they see us as all united in this united front, no matter what, come what may, I think it is actually a disservice to our politics, and a disservice to young Canadians in particular, I would say, but all Canadians who want to put their trust in us and want us to behave, I think, differently at times. And so I think we have to emphasize a different culture. I think we have to emphasize a culture of ideas, frankly, and we have to emphasize a culture of respectful disagreement with opponents across the aisle, of course, but also with our own party, and to hold our own parties accountable for when there are missteps. And we have to emphasize right answers in policy above and beyond winning elections in many respects. I mean, we win elections in order to serve ideas. We don't put ideas forward to win elections, and we have to remember that at times. So with that, I cede my time, and I look forward to Elizabeth's comments.
Thank you so much, Nate. Really appreciate that. The role of the MP and loyalties. I think that's going to be a topic we may bring up more in the post after Elizabeth's comments, which I very much look forward to. One thing I didn't mention in my introduction of Elizabeth is that a very key and relevant role that she plays in vis-a-vis our conversation tonight is chair of the Democracy Caucus, which works to improve democracy and protection of MP rights within the chamber. And she mentioned to me that her last two books also dealt a great deal with the loss of democracy as political parties, relates to what Nate's been saying, increase their power over their own MPs. And coupled with the perils of first past the post, in her opinion, those are threats that she sees to our Magna Carta tradition. So with that, I hand it over to you, Elizabeth.
Yeah. I wasn't going to mention this, Brian. First of all, Stephanie, that was just such fun to have you hold forth, and thank you. And to Nate as well. That you can tell we're friends. So when we start talking about working across party lines, it's a real thing, and it should happen a lot more. But as you were talking, Brian, I realized that it was a long time ago, actually, when my book, Losing Confidence, came out, that we had a discussion on Sunday edition. And Michael Enright introduced the topic, but he had James Travers, who's no longer with us, who was a wonderful journalist, lead off. And he said, Jim, Elizabeth saying here that democracy is in crisis. What do you think? And it was a marvelous moment, because James Travers said, well, actually, Michael, it's democracy. Elizabeth understates how bad the situation is. Actually, if you go to Ottawa these days, what you'll see is essentially a democracy theme park, We have the buildings. You can see the parliament. You can see the, but really, it's a dictatorship run by the prime minister's office. Now, going back and way back, Stephanie, because when you mentioned that about the friendly dictatorship of Jean Chrétien, this was not always thus. And I'm old enough to have actually been friends with Tom Kent, who was the principal secretary to Lester B. Pearson. Now, quickly, I will add, I was not his contemporary. I was waitressing and cooking on the Cabot Trail when Tom Kent was the head of the Cape Breton Development Corporation. And we became friends when I brought him a particularly good bowl of chowder. But I did get chances to get to know Tom Kent. And in those days, and my member of parliament, by the way, was Alan J. McCacken. So I learned a lot about parliamentary procedures. But before Pierre Trudeau, okay, so the last prime minister before Pierre Trudeau, Lester B. Pearson, Tom Kent told me there was no PMO. The prime minister's office was a handful of file clerks and stenographers. There was no central agency called PMO. So there's been a creation of this stuff, just as the idea of party discipline is new. Now, of course, you go way back. Sir John A. Macdonald used to refer to his caucus members as loose fish because you never knew where they were going to go. And I think Nate and Stephanie, and we can all say that of recent years, most fish have been really well nailed down. And if they try to swim away, they're told about it. I'm a big fan of Westminster parliamentary democracy, huge fan. I grew up in the States, so I also have seen from when I grew up in the States, there used to be such things as Republicans who were more left-wing than some Democrats. This a complete overruling of thought by partisanship is dangerous. You don't want to pick people to run for office who are prepared, unlike Nate and Stephanie, to check their brains at the door and do whatever they're told to do. That's not healthy. And our system of government since the Magna Carta has been about having the right to speak to power. The Westminster parliamentary tradition does that, but with the overlay of the growth of political parties and with first past the post, we do have a problem. And Nate mentioned it, that someone, a prime minister whose party wins the majority of seats does not need to have the majority of public support, obviously, but has 100% of the power, all of the executive power and all the legislative power. And it's essentially unchecked. So people who go to school in the US, and I meant to mention to you, Brian, that the new leader of our Green Party, Annemie Paul, is also a lawyer, but also went to Princeton. So we end up having, but there are a lot of lawyers in politics, which I don't think is a bad thing, but we end up having this notion that somehow it's always been this way. I was lucky to start working in Ottawa in 1986, where I was senior policy advisor to the Federal Minister of Environment. And even then, in the mid to late 80s and early 90s, Parliament was way more collaborative, way more collegial, and the power of the Prime Minister's office was not as overwhelming as it became. And it's very hard because if every Prime Minister who grabs the levers of power consolidates more power and then passes it on to the next person, I do think Justin Trudeau has reduced the power of PMO slightly compared to what was exerted under Stephen Harper. That's my experience as an MP not belonging to either of those parties. But it's extraordinary how much power was exerted in the Harper days, Stephanie. Totally amazing. But what I wanted to just mention briefly is a lot of the things that could improve parliamentary democracy go directly to reducing the power of people who aren't elected. The backroom strategists, the political party staffs, the people who decide that we're going to bring forward a bill because it'll be good at election time, as opposed to it's what's in the interest of the people of Canada. So reducing the power of political parties, enhancing the rights of MPs, and responsible government, basically, which it includes the backbenchers of a party in power. A backbencher's job is to hold the government to account with tough questions. So restoring our traditions means unlearning some of what I think has been imbibed from south of the border about partisanship, and really embracing that when an election is over, I think we should take all the spin doctor type people and put them in a box till later. And that was more what happened in the old days, like old days. In the 80s, when I worked in Ottawa first, there was way more collaboration, way more thoughtful discourse than we see now. And we need to fight for that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Well, thank you, Stephanie, Nathaniel, and Elizabeth, for your opening comments. I think what we'll do is maybe just move into, I'll take this moment to tell all attendees that the Q&A function is open. So please feel free, it's been open from the get-go. So feel free to put your questions in there. And once we get to the full Q&A, we'll be able to, I'm happy to take questions whenever, because I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. But what I'd like to maybe just touch on a bit with our panelists is this topic of question period. Just wanted to make sure I touched on this because it's obviously been very different in COVID. But even before, I'm sure people were asking questions about what value does it have? What role does it play? Most Canadians see, little sound bites on the news every, once in a while, 60 seconds, but you live and breathe it much more than non-parliamentarians do. So I guess maybe I'd just like to open up a bit of a discussion, and I'm happy to kind of go in the order we have been going already. Stephanie, Nate, and then Elizabeth, if you have something you'd like to add, just in terms of the role of question period in your view, its value, maybe some myths about it, things that could be improved, things that are like problematic about it. Just want to see where we can go there, COVID related or otherwise. Stephanie, maybe I'll go with you first.
Sure. Well, I mean, speaking in the House always has incredible weight, and this is why I've made an effort to get back here once a week, a month. I mean, this week alone, in 5 days, I did 3 speeches, which is just unheard of in pre-COVID times. Like, you'd be lucky to do a speech every 2 weeks, every month if you were lucky. 3 speeches, 1 statement, 2 question period questions, 1 adjournment speech, in addition to numerous other social media things. But question period for me, I mean, it's problematic on 2 fronts. On the first one, like this, I don't think Nate would disagree, but he can't, like, you don't get the real answers, right? You get the canned answers. And yes, Elizabeth, this was no different in the Harper era where, the minister sits there with a binder, and when they heard the question, they're like flipping through their binder, like, Mr. Speaker, and they read whatever response is there. Would we be different if we got into government again? Probably. And the other thing is, I mean, it just creates a, within the party, it's just a real slugfest to get on the docket for that day. It's, this, my husband tells me all the time, like, this is not a something based, anything based on merit. It doesn't matter how many degrees you have or how many languages you speak or what you experiences before. Like, so much of it depends upon, like, what's the mood of the day. For conservatives, it's always the base loves her, the base loves him, the base. So, I think it's problematic in 2 regards, in that the intention to get questions answered isn't sincere, but also I'm not sure. I think the asking is, I think when we go with questions, they are well thought out, but it's always to get that clip, like it's their fault. It's never the type of, you talked about congeniality, that it's not really about that. And it really ends up being, within like a scorecard, like I got so many questions, or you see who's hot and upcoming based upon how many, and we have our standards. And so, and I think that even creates, what's the word I'm looking for? Morale problems internally within us. Like, if people don't get up enough, or this person's up all the time. So, and as well, it's frustrating, but it does set the tone. I will say that for your party as well, and what the brand that you're creating, and the message that you are sending to Canadians. And you have, again, we talked about dictatorships within the House, so that one exists with in your own party as well. Like, it's not up to you if you're up that day. If you're lucky, you get an email at 8:03 that says, you have 2 questions in QP today on blah blah blah, and oh, hooray, and the days you don't, whatever, you're watching at 2:15 and you're just like, damn it, them again, I can't be, So it's, it's just there's just lack of democracy everywhere. But my point is, questions aren't answered, and it's really used as a communications tool rather than a search for information and truth. Brian, thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Appreciate that. Nate.
So I have not asked very many questions since being elected in 2015, because I don't see a great use, particularly as a member of the governing party, to ask a question that is ultimately going to be run up the flagpole first, and they're going to look at the the way I write the question, and I'm very insistent on writing my own question, and I decline to ask questions that are given to me, and so I just don't ask very many questions. I will say people should lower their expectations for question period, insofar as the people asking the questions are there to score points, and the people answering the questions are there to make sure points are not scored. So it is not really the truth-seeking function we might want it to be. It could be if we change some of the format potentially. So I quite like the 5-minute exchange format that existed during the initial virtual parliament before we went back to regular QP. I quite like that. It allows an opposition member to intervene in some way to say, actually, I'm going to go back to that point and answer the damn question. For me, the function that question period usefully serves is twofold. One, I watch opposition members coordinate their questions in a very useful way at times, and they can, if they're not so cheap and partisan about it, they can actually put an issue on the agenda in a really serious way and make the government answer to a particular issue and knock that issue into the media, and therefore question period can really work for an opposition party. I think another way, it's a testing ground for members of parliament, for parliamentary secretaries, and for opposition members. Who is good at this? Who can get on their feet, and who is good at this job? And some people are not good at it. And I watch from the backbench as far as it goes, and I can see who's good at it and who's not. And so there's some testing ground function from what I can tell that question period serves, but people should lower their expectations overall.
Thanks, Nate. Elizabeth.
Oh, I have so much to say about this. Okay, first of all, as a member of a non-recognized party, when I was first elected, which is almost 10 years ago, I had a question a week. It's now a question a month. And Jagmeet Singh says that's fair. I don't find it very fair. We question period in Canada, and Thomas Falcone on the question Q&As online was just asking, what's different in Canada? Doesn't question period seem more meaningful in the UK? Well, here's what's different in Canada. We are the only parliamentary democracy in all of the Westminster parliamentary democracies where our Speaker of the House has voluntarily ceded his or her authority to decide who asks the questions. Only in Canada is it the process that Stephanie just described of the party whip deciding who gets to ask the questions. So in the UK and in India and in New Zealand and in Australia, yada, yada, people write the speaker, an MP would write the speaker and say, I want to ask a question. This is the question I want to ask to this minister the day before. The speaker then lets them know you're going to get a shot at it. And then they ask their question. So who are you trying to impress if you're an MP? In our system, you're trying to be the pit bull attack dog from an opposition party that does the best job tearing at their ankles. That's not the person the speaker's going to pick. The speaker's going to pick the person who doesn't heckle, observes the rules, and asks cogent questions that are respectful of the institution. So we've set up a system of rewards and punishments only in Canada that privilege those who are particularly good at the zinger. Not so helpful for a respectful discourse. In my case, when I do get a question, and I started this practice when I was first elected, I always give the minister to whom I'm going to ask the question in advance, so they have time to think about giving me a decently good answer. I don't like the scripted answers. I got better answers out of ministers than other people asking questions on the same topic. And wherever I could before COVID, I'd go over and talk to them ahead of time and say, look, this is what I'm trying to get at. I'm really hoping you can give a good, I got one of my questions in question period, actually, I know for sure, got Canada to re-enter the decertification convention. Other questions have raised issues that really needed attention. So I think question period could be improved by the simple expedient of the Speaker of the House following our existing rules, because what I just described as the voluntary ceding of authority is, it's a longer story and I'm probably running out of time, but it was Jean Sauvé, when she was speaker, said she couldn't see all the way to the end of the room. So could the whips help her out and hand her a list of who was going to ask the questions? There's no rule. That's just become our tradition. And it really works against what we should be doing in question period, which is holding the government of the day to account and trying to get better answers.
I completely agree with that, by the way. And I know Michael Chong and others have really emphasized empowering the speaker, which therefore empowers parliamentarians. And I think that would be a ready solution to a number of different problems.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, Elizabeth, Nate. Nate, you mentioned the role of question period, the value it can have for opposition parties, certainly, in terms of putting certain things on the agenda. And I feel like we'd be remiss not to talk about the effect that COVID has had on question period, just the functioning of our parliament in general. There've been a lot of discussions about fewer sittings, more governance seemingly by press conference, or at least that feeling held by some people, accountability issues, indeed the role of opposition parties in a situation where it feels like it's more governance by press conference by the Prime Minister. And so maybe just want to open it up pretty broadly to your respective views on kind of how democracy has been faring, particularly in the COVID era. And maybe there's some things, some surprising positives, but maybe there's been some not so positives. So I just want to kind of open it up to have that discussion. And I'll just mention again, the Q&A I see is populating. So keep your questions coming. We'll be sure to get to them when we get to the Q&A very shortly. So Stephanie, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Brian. I mean, I think, for instance, things like, I think it has accelerated processes perhaps which were coming, but I don't necessarily think are good for democracy. So I think about how this last week, it was the first week that we implemented the voting app. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm so happy not to sit on Zoom for 5 hours while we go through every single vote in the House. But it's, I know we should feel there's a significant authentication process where a terrible photo of you is taken. But nonetheless, things like that sort of leave me concerned. I mean, and that's even before we get into the topic of legislation that's been passed, where there's been loopholes, and we've got to return to the House to fix the loopholes. The most interesting thing for me is just, it's an entirely different medium on Zoom than when you're in the House. And I think that's another reason I make such an effort to make it to the House. When I'm on Zoom, I feel much smaller. I think before I thought about an entire outfit, and now I really have to think about my brand from this way up. But individuals who I thought before came across really well in person don't come across well in Zoom as communicators. And then some is the opposite, some which I really didn't take. And I know this has it doesn't have to do with the democratic process, because it relates to how people are communicating, how they're perceived, and how they're perceived, which of course affects people's and Canadians' ideas. And actually the one who stand out to me the most, where they didn't really make an impact on me in the House, but they've made a significant, I think they're incredibly effective on Zoom, Elizabeth, is actually Jenica. In the House, I didn't notice her at all, but on Zoom, there's just a calmness, and she's incredibly well over Zoom. So for me, as I said, there has been, I think given the situation, we've done a good job of adjusting to the pandemic environment. I think there are lapses in democracy, but I think they were sort of ultimately inevitable, as much as my whips and House leaders did a job to push against them. But what stands out to me the most is the communication, because the lens, the frame through which we view our democracy has changed entirely. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Stephanie. Nate.
Yeah, so I think it's not so much the physical distancing in some respects, but in any emergency, Elizabeth talked about great centralization in our executive, and any emergency concentrates that kind of decision-making even more. We have been lucky though in Canada, at least at the federal level, and I can't say the same for provincial legislatures, but for our staff to stand up a virtual parliament in a way that they did, there is something lost unquestionably, where I don't get to have informal conversations with Stephanie, and with I can't just walk across and sit next to someone and have informal chats and build up support for different issues, or understand their perspective in a more serious way, and build a relationship fundamentally, which allows you to do this job much more effectively. So there is something lost in that regard. But overall, and I can't put the same, we had Pornhub executives come before my committee and was able to cross-examine them fairly effectively. Sure, was it as effective if I'd been in person? Probably not. So that there is a little bit lost as far as it goes, but I would say overall, we have, because of the staff of Parliament and standing this up, we've been able to get back to it fairly quickly. So after the immediate time in the spring, there has been greater accountability once a full virtual Parliament was stood up in the fall. And so credit to staff for that. And as far as virtual voting goes, the only thing I would say is I actually quite like the idea of virtual voting. And I also like it because I don't need to get cheered by the opposition every time I vote differently from the government. It's fine if it's just sort of, I just go about my day and I do what I was going to do anyway. And it's not like we're the only jurisdiction where this happens. I mean, Israel's had virtual voting for at least procedural matters for a very long time. So in any event, I think we aren't likely to stick with some of these mechanisms over a long period of time outside of COVID, except maybe for families with young kids or individuals who are experiencing some health issue. We now have the technology, and we can keep it in those circumstances.
Thanks so much, Nate. Appreciate that. Elizabeth, any thoughts on Parliament in the COVID era?
Well, there's so much, and the process of trying to figure out how we could reconcile the need that the Parliament of Canada not become essentially a vector of disease with all of its coming to Ottawa, then going home to our ridings. And I agree with you, Stephanie. I miss being in Ottawa. If I could be there once a week, I would. But from Vancouver Island going to Ottawa, which I did March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, part of every month I was in Ottawa. And it was a 2-day trip once Air Canada changed the flights out here. And it felt unsafe at every level. I'm very relieved to feel okay and safe. I haven't gotten on an airplane since October 6th, except for that little trip to St. Bart's. But no, just kidding, just a little joke there. I haven't gotten on an airplane since October 7th when I flew home. But I do think parliamentary democracy has worked well. I think opposition parties have held government to account. We had the initial March 13th of 2020, we adjourned. That unanimous consent motion was we were going to adjourn till April 20th. In my head, as I stood up in the House and gave unanimous consent on behalf of the Green Party, I was thinking, we're going to have April 20th is a little long, but I guess it's better to be safe. I mean, who knew that we'd be a year later still in pandemic? But in that period, we were back in the House actually. And Jenica Atwin, whom Stephanie, that was so sweet of you, thank you. Jenica went back on behalf of the Green Caucus for the vote on the first legislation. So you're reconciling, we can't all be there, but we have a right to vote. So any legislation that's going through at that point, without distance voting, we had to do everything through unanimous consent, which is why one Green had to be there at all times in case there was something we had to say no. Now, it's been referred to as a power grab, but I want to make the opposite argument. The first draft legislation that came out of Finance Canada, I think it was March 25th-ish, was appalling. It said the Minister of Finance is going to have the right to raise or lower a budget as he sees fit till the end of 2020, till December 31st, 2021, I think it said. Now, first of all, this was shared in advance because they needed unanimous consent. We were all on the phone with each other in a New York minute. Like I was on the phone with Pierre Poilievre. We were talking, we saying, this is nuts. And the PBO gave us a briefing, everyone saying, this is nuts. We telegraphed it immediately to the government. I honestly think that a lot of key people in the political side of things didn't know that was what Finance Canada bureaucrats were going to come up with. I think they were genuinely kind of horrified too. It was rolled back immediately. There were 2 more versions rewritten, all shared in a very horizontal fashion, and then unanimous consent. I think it's been fascinating. And particularly for me, I was on the phone, I was on email with ministers at a high level almost all the time. Part of it was wonderful, was everyone was working from home. So a lot of very powerful people didn't have gatekeepers anymore. Everybody was way more available. And we also, which was a huge benefit to individual MPs, because our constituents were all wanting to know, what's that program? What's going on? Zillions of questions. We had a daily briefing, and I don't think this ever got covered in the media, offered every day with senior civil servants from a range of departments. Anyone could call in, ask any question. And if they couldn't get to it that day, they asked it the next day. This included, by the way, Saturdays and Sundays. And sometimes I remember one time there was a senior Finance Canada guy answering a question I had, and then his kid screamed in the background, and I realized, right, everyone's at home. We're, but there were, in fact, 200 daily briefings like that every single day, 7 days a week. I think in that period of pandemic, we were all hands on deck. And my favorite thing is when you can't tell what party anybody is. And that was that kind of moment. So I think parliamentary democracy survived COVID well, but as partisanship rears its ugly head, we're back to the problems that I find perennially offensive.
And if I could just add on that, because I do agree with Elizabeth in relation to the need to be really responsive. And we felt not only across party lines, as you can see from Elizabeth, but as a caucus, that idea of centralization, what Stephanie was saying, sort of, it's a friendly dictatorship of sorts. It was quite the opposite in early days of COVID, where we had not only the daily briefings for all parliamentarians, but we had an hour every day set aside for caucus calls from various ministers. And it really did, I think, enable the government to avoid missteps at times, where they could feel how programs were rolling out on the ground in real time and know we have to adjust things. And things were adjusted. And there has been, I think, especially in the first number of months, there was a real active, we are listening, we're changing, we're adjusting on the fly, and we're trying to get this right. And so I do think the more responsive that the government can be in that regard, not only within caucus as it was, but also across party lines, then ultimately the better decisions that are made in the end.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, Nate, Elizabeth. Just before we get to the Q&A, I'm going to ask one more question, one more round, and it's to do with voter turnout and elections. Obviously, elections are the lifeblood of democracy. In terms of talking about parliamentary democracy and its future, it seems like it's something that's worth talking about. In the 2019 election, voter turnout was 66%. And so I guess my question, and it seems particularly relevant, who knows, we may well have an election sooner rather than later, one doesn't know, but could happen. In any event, I think it's an important question to ask regardless of that. What do you think, this question has been asked many times, but I think it is worth asking again, what could be done either by parliamentarians, by Parliament itself, by other stakeholders to try to get that number higher, to get it, 66% is, we're a robust, advanced liberal democracy, and yet that's where we are. And so maybe I'll just get your thoughts, quick thoughts on what could be done to try to maybe move that number, move the needle. Stephanie.
Thanks, Brian. I'm probably not the best person to ask because I feel, this is a right. If you don't want to exercise that right, then you lose. But also too, I think this speaks to my just position on human nature in general. I think unless people are motivated for one reason
right.
or another, they just don't do it. And there even in our advanced state of democracy, if you will, people just, they're busy raising their kids, working, I know, my routine outside of work it's just literally like laundry, dishes, food prep, like this is all I do. And I watched Weekend during the halftime show of the Super Bowl. That was exciting. So, it's hard to really wake people up to, unless there's something that they care about. And they have a hard time like relating from one thing to it's just the state of human nature. And I'm even feeling that in my current portfolio of transport. We're talking now about no help for the airline sector, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what's going to happen like 6 months, a year from now? Everyone's will want to go on a flight somewhere. Demand will skyrocket, supply will be limited. And, what are they going to do? They're going to blame the airlines. They're going to be like, oh, those terrible airlines, they're, gouging us, when in fact it was a result, in my opinion, of government not. So my point is Canadians, or individuals, not even individuals, aren't capable of, I think, doing logic and reason to a large extent, unless they're incredibly motivated. That's my feeling. And for me, I think it does go back to my comments about C76, about parties and candidates and individuals. I even think of my own nomination, right? In Calgary, Vindemor, historically, the nomination is the election. You want to win the nomination, and it was up to me to get all of those people out. So this is a right, and you can choose to exercise it or not. And if you don't, then you accept the consequences of whichever friendly dictator you've put into place. So I apologize that it's not more positive or constructive ideas for engagement. But that is where my head is at, Brian. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate it. Nate.
I suppose I would say I agree with Stephanie insofar as it is a right, and I don't know what the magic number is of the perfect voter turnout. I mean, it's 66% across the country, as you say. It was 73% in Beaches East York in 2015 and down to 69% in 2019. I don't know what the right number is in my riding or across the country, but I would add that I think it's also a responsibility. And so I do want more people to vote, and I want everyone to exercise the vote in the sense that they are educated and they are actively engaged and they're active participants in the democratic process. And the answer to that, I think, frankly, is education. So am I going to get someone who has no history of voting, who has no engagement in the political sphere, to wake up one day and say, well, you know what, I'm coming out and I want change? Maybe, but I'm much better off, I think, spending my efforts in grade 5 classrooms and grade 6 classrooms in high schools, explain to them why politics matters and that everything they care about ultimately comes down to politics, because politics means government, and government is the way we solve collective action problems. And the more I do that, then I think the more voting becomes habitual. The student vote that happens in high schools and elementary schools, I think, is really important. People should read the news. I mean, just these are habits that ultimately better our democracy and ultimately lead to more people voting.
That's great. Thanks, Nate. Elizabeth, I'll give you the final word before we go to Q&A.
Well, I'm sure Stephanie, Nate know what I'm going to say. For people to vote, they have to know their vote's going to count. And the reason that for Stephanie, the election is the nomination process is that it's a safe conservative seat. And once you say that, you enforce in the minds of everybody who might want to vote for another party, there's no point, because of first past the post and the way it works. So if it's empirical, it's not an opinion. If people are interested in the differences between proportional representation and first past the post, Arndt Liebhardt's written an incredible book called Patterns of Democracy, which is an empirical review of, I think it's 36 or 40 democracies around the world. Some have winner-take-all majoritarian systems like ours. Others use what he calls consensus-based election systems like proportional representation. And by the way, in reference to COVID, the countries that did the best in managing COVID happened to have been, it was reported quite a lot, they were countries with women prime ministers. They're also all countries that use proportional representation. And voter turnout is always higher in countries with PR. Now, I also say that for people who, for the Greens, we only win elections when we get people who've given up to turn out. So in my case, I defeated a member of the Harper cabinet in 2011, and voter turnout here was the highest in the country at 75%. Because a lot of people who'd given up, because it was always a conservative who won here, they didn't think there was much point in voting. And once they began to think, could it be? Is it possible? Could change really happen? Gee whiz. So, and that's been a pattern for Greens elected in New Brunswick, Greens elected in PEI, Greens elected in, Peter Bevan Baker in PEI was elected with 92% voter turnout in his riding, but that is in fact Prince Edward Island. But we have high voter turnout when people believe there's a reason to vote. But in the meantime, if we had proportional representation, which of course we do have, Nate, because you campaigned on it, right? 2015 is the last election under first past the post. So hallelujah, brother.
I'll say I completely agree, and that's why it had my vote.
There you go.
And Elizabeth, I'll say too quickly, I went to help our conservative candidate in Fredericton, and I remember touring a brewery and that. And when I was going around, I saw the conservative vote. They were old people staying at the Fredericton Inn where I was at, and I had breakfast there with them. But as we went amongst into the community, I'm like, I smell something here. No, it's not Liberal. It's not NDP. And when she won, I was like, yes. So very interesting.
Wonderful.
I didn't know you'd had on the ground experience in Fredericton. And next time you come back, I want you to be there as the first Calgary Green candidate.
Well, heaven forbid I'm prime minister of our conservative in your party.
Well, the thing of it, but I promise you, since we're going to get corrupt eventually within the Green Party publicly right here at Hart House, I'll promise you that you will be the first Green foreign minister.
There we go.
Oh, an offer, Nate.
Aspirations achieved.
I'm
Nate
a negotiator for sure. So yeah.
Well, on that note, we'll transition into Q&A. So I'm really glad for our discussion so far. It's been wonderful. The Q&A slide has just come out. A number of you have already posed questions in the Q&A. You'll see this slide here shows you where that button is on the bottom of your screen. So feel free to use it, and I will be able to filter through them, and hopefully we'll get to as many as we possibly can. So with that, we'll move into the Q&A officially. And I'll start off with this question from, forgive my pronunciation if I have this wrong, Douglas Trailhard. Let me see if I can pull it up here. The question is, what is the solution to concentration of power in the PMO? So what is the solution to concentration of power in the PMO, or solutions or aspects of that solution? Stephanie, I'll start with you. What do you think?
Again, Brian, I apologize. I can't see past winning government and being in the PMO, so I'm going to pass. Like, that's all I see right now. There's nothing else. Nothing else exists. Plan B is another 12 years in Calgary, Vindemor till I go to Palm Springs and play tennis. But you know, I don't see anything else. I'm trying. No, can't do it. No, sorry, Nate.
I appreciate the candor. I really do. Nate, go ahead.
I'd say a few things quickly. Elizabeth touched on a few different things where when you move power away from party whips, well, party whips don't make decisions independently of the PMO, and at least on the government side. And so that kind of moving away from the centralization of parties, I think you move away in some respects to the centralization of the PMO once we see different parties that hold power, and giving some of that power back to the speaker. I think empowering parliamentarians, so empowering parliamentary chairs of committees in a more serious way, looking to what the UK does in this regard. I do think if we had more members of parliament in the chamber as the UK does, that probably has something to do with it as well. And I suppose lastly, I mean, I would just emphasize, I think culture, that's why I emphasize culture at the outset. I do think that we have to, just as parliamentarians, not expect a particular change to take place to fix the problem, that we have to demand it for ourselves and act the way we want the institutions to be. And it ultimately, I think, in the end, will rely upon a commitment from a prime minister that takes that office and then devolves that kind of power.
Thanks, Nate. Elizabeth.
Kill the budget. PMO is run on budget money. Cut it in half. There are so many people occupying Langevin block and nobody checks the budget. If you go back to our constitution, the prime minister, I mentioned earlier, the prime minister's office wasn't a thing until Pierre Trudeau created it. But the prime minister isn't that big a thing either when you read the constitution. The theory of our parliamentary democracy is that all members of parliament are equals, and the prime minister is prima inter pares, first among equals. And so the prime minister certainly, I'm old enough to have had the privilege, as I keep saying, of wonderful stories and anecdotes from people like John Turner. I remember hearing John Turner explain at an event at Queen's University at their Study of Democracy Center that when he was Minister of Justice under Pierre Trudeau, he would sit down and share in advance his ideas for new legislation with the other critics from the other parties for justice, and they would work out what they wanted together. It wasn't some big secret cooked up in PMO. And when the first time Thomas Axworthy, who of course is now the famous Thomas Axworthy, was a young staffer in PMO for Pierre Trudeau, he was sent over to tell John Turner something. And Turner turned on him and said, "You go back and tell your boss, we don't need some junior G man from PMO coming over here and telling me what to do." So it's cultural, yes. First past the post culturally, Nate, is what you mentioned, the cultural change. If we went to proportional representation, we'd have a cultural change, such as what happened in New Zealand when they stopped using first past the post and moved to PR. Because there's a reason Jacinda Ardern, for example, who just won a majority of seats for her party, put Green Party members in her cabinet because she just got used to how good they were working together with her people. This is a cultural change that is needed, and it really isn't like people are well, never mind. You get my point. We really need to cut the power out of cut the legs out from under PMO, whoever the prime minister is.
Nate, did you have a response?
No,
Sorry,
just that I agree. And it's a good example, actually, of the interaction between rules and culture, right? That these are not necessarily distinct ideas, and that if we did change certain rules, including our electoral system, the most fundamental set of rules we could change, obviously that would have deep impacts for culture with respect to the centralization of the PMO and beyond that.
Very good. Thank you. Our next question is from Asher Honickman. Should we be encouraging the emergence of more independent candidates and MPs, for example, through allowing them to register riding associations or issue tax receipts prior to the writ being issued? Will more independence like Jody Wilson-Raybould mean more independence in the House from party and non-party members alike? What do you think, Stephanie?
No.
Okay, fair enough. Nate?
I, as much as I emphasize the need for greater independence in our parliament, I am not convinced that individual independent members of parliament, if we sent 338 independent members of parliament, the system would function significantly better as far as it goes. I think the party vehicles are important if they're used in the right way. And I don't think that more Jody Wilson-Raybould's would necessarily be good for our democracy as far as it goes.
That's what I wanted to say. Sorry, Elizabeth, but Nate put it far more eloquently. Sorry, Nate, to jump in now. Sorry, Brian, to jump in now, but exactly. Obviously, it doesn't serve me in my position and my party and our objectives now. But I agree, Nate. It's similar to the comment I made in the opening round where I said to Elizabeth, your party isn't advanced yet to have the problems of complexity of personalities and individuals and systems and maybe that will never happen, Elizabeth. Maybe it will be an anomaly, but thank you, Nate.
Yeah, no, the Greens around the world have evolved and been in government and all that. And we keep managing around the world after existing since the early 80s. We've managed to avoid giving up on notions of consensus decision making and that the leader doesn't have power and that we don't use whips. And that's true around the world. But one of the things about independence, and this is another anomaly of Westminster parliamentary democracy, as in Canada and uniquely in Canada, is the concept that there's such a thing as recognized parties, and you have to have 12 seats before you have any rights. So Jody, like me, gets one question a month. Every time one of your big parties throws out a member, those of us who are in what's called either an unrecognized party or a true independent get fewer questions in question period because they get diluted with however many people have been thrown into the penalty box with us. This is really manifestly unfair. So I think Jody Wilson-Raybould is fantastic. I think her voice is needed, but if we could actually examine how wrong it is that Canada alone has decided once you have 12 MPs, not only do the people of Canada give your party a couple $1 million a year for the work that you're doing, which is nonpartisan research, et cetera, but you get to sit on committees. That wasn't, again, this weirdness in Canada that, like the Jean Sauvé story, that became one day's accident becomes the rule without changing the rules. Back in 1963, when Canada was almost 100 years old, the bigger parties decided that because they were big, they needed money. So they passed this law that said, we will get money if you're a recognized party and have more than 12 seats. Nothing in that law touched on, do you get to sit on a committee? Do you get to ask questions in question period? Do you get to put forward opposition day motions? None of those things were mentioned. But then they were, in fact, by tradition and by custom, adopted. So one of the reasons why, unless you had 12 MPs who formed themselves an independent party and then got some rights and some money, it's really hard. And I've been very successful as a single member of parliament in making real change from my corner. But the rights I had as a member of parliament, as the sole member of the Green Party in 2011, were taken away from me steadily by conservatives and liberals, such as I no longer have the right to speak and put forward amendments. I can put forward, under the rules as they now exist, I have the right to put forward substantive amendments at report stage, which other party members and other parties don't. It's a very complicated story, but I was too effective using those rights I had. So they took them away through the fiction that spontaneously every committee in standing committee passed the same motion that said we could be invited to present our amendments at committee stage, which was solely to take away the right I have on paper to present substantive amendments at report stage. So the larger parties squash the rest of us a lot. And you'd think with the limited amounts of power you have, where you're in a party with less than 12, the bigger parties wouldn't need to keep trying to squash us. So I figure we must be doing a pretty good job because they haven't done with the squashing yet.
Nate.
Well, and to your point, Elizabeth, and Asher raises a good point just about what other rules could we put into place that would level the playing field such that parties hold less power as far as it goes. And so I do think those are, you know, if you are offside a party, then maybe you get kicked off a committee. If you're offside a party, then maybe you're taken out of a parliamentary association. If you're offside a party in the worst case, then they don't sign your nomination papers. And if they don't sign your nomination papers, you are at an immediate disadvantage if you can't organize as an independent candidate on equal footing to a riding association. So I think fairly, there are probably rule changes that need to be made to level the playing field in some respects along those lines.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, MPs, for that. A question from an anonymous attendee, and I like especially the end of it, because I would like to see this happen, actually. Question: Canada has more parties than a first past the post system normally allows. A move towards proportional representation would lead to more party fragmentation and likely coalition governments. Are the panelists ready to run a government together? I think so, based on the collaboration collegiality I'm seeing, but I'd just like to see what you think about that. I know Elizabeth is ready. She's already unmuted, so I'm.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, Elizabeth, go ahead. No. Go ahead. Elizabeth, go for it.
Okay, this is a wonderful story of how culture changes when you change the voting system. All around the world, Greens, and as I said, we're in 80 countries around the world. The party that hates us the most everywhere is Labour. They're like Jeremy Corbyn went after Carolyn Lucas, and anyway, it's a long story. It's always the same. The NDP goes after us like they want to run us over with a car. I love the NDP. I'd like to work with them. It's a good idea. What changes that allows coalitions to happen is the culture. Not just that you get the question from Anonymous is a very good one. It's not just that you get more parties, you have to work in coalitions. It's that you change the culture so you know cooperation does not result in punishment at the polls. So when I said in 2008 that I thought I was leader of the Green Party, and I said, well, for the good of the climate, we know I'm not going to be prime minister. Stéphane Dion, if it's not me, it should be Stéphane Dion, because Jack Layton is also great, but he's not going to be prime minister. So it seemed to be like a common sense thing to say, but I was hugely punished for it, even by the media, like, whoa, what's she doing? That's a crazy idea. She's essentially endorsing the Liberals. And I had Green candidates running everywhere, and they were agreeing. They're saying, no, that's sensible. We want to get elected, but climate is more important. And we really should point out that. So the culture of first past the post is one that rewards partisanship and the dog whistle and the wedge issue. Now, in New Zealand, we have a perfect test case, because Labour in New Zealand used to treat the Greens just the way the NDP treat us here. But when they changed from first past the post to mixed member proportional in the mid-90s, my friends in New Zealand say it took 2 election cycles for people to begin to realize, right, we don't need to say the nastiest things about the Greens. We could say things about the conservative right-wing party that we actually disagree with more, without risking having our vote bleed off and seat by seat electing more Greens. Mixed member proportional is why in 2017, the leader of Labour, Jacinda Ardern, could go into an election with James Shaw, co-leader of the Greens, saying in advance, if you vote for us, we will form a coalition government later. We will support each other in government. And that's why Jacinda Ardern became prime minister, because it was a minority parliament. They didn't have enough seats to form government. The party that had won more of the seats might have formed government, but this pact that was arranged ahead of time was far more democratic. It's just something Canadians aren't used to, and it does lead to, I submit, better government.
Very good. Thank you, Elizabeth. Stephanie, or actually, Nate's unmuted first. I'll go with Nate first.
Sure. So I think simple answer, yes, I would be happy to work across party lines and govern across party lines. And I would say, just on a personal note, I've seen success in committee work working across party lines. I've certainly seen privacy legislation move forward in a serious way because of working with Bob Zimmer, Peter Kent from the Conservatives, and Charlie Angus from the NDP. I more recently, I have a very good relationship with Michelle Rempel, and we've been able to accomplish things together. And Stephanie is a good example where we've discussed elections and legislation and privacy rules, and to be able to have those collaborative conversations and to not always agree, obviously, but to understand on what ideas we disagree and why we disagree, and to have those fulsome conversations. I think we're all better for it. Just recently at our industry committee, I was able to work with Pierre Poilievre to amend a motion and pass it unanimously. So I think there are opportunities to work together. And I do agree with Elizabeth that electoral reform would get us there. I would say, though, that we all ought to recognize as MPs in the system in which we live that Canadians do expect that kind of collaboration, that one of the reasons they want change in our electoral systems, one of the reasons they want to see less partisanship, is they want to see us working together in the best interest of Canadians. And so I do think we have to take that idea more seriously than we do sometimes.
Thanks, Nate. Stephanie, any thoughts? Would you like to govern with Nate and Elizabeth? I get a really nice sense of collegiality here, which is wonderful to see.
There is a nice sense of collegiality between us. Again, I think I don't work very well in hypotheticals. I really adjust my strategies in terms of effectiveness for my constituents and my values and my principles according to existing realities. And so I struggle to think what that would look like, even after my time in Equal Voice. For a number of reasons, because certainly as much as I thought it was a great organization, I did also feel that there were some challenges with it as well because of party lines. Even though it's a multi-partisan organization, party lines, individuals who were members of the group belong to parties. So I struggle to think of what that looks like on in a system, in a true systemic change. Very much so. I agree with what Nate said about working with people across lines to achieve things. And on any given day, on any motion in a committee, you are able to find agreement with some colleagues in an effort to achieve something. And it's especially unique and important in this time in a minority. If you can gel in my position, with the NDP and the Bloc, you're able to achieve a lot of stuff. So that's my thoughts. And as well, I do think it depends upon our players. Like, Nate mentioned some people. They are, don't be fooled. The individuals he mentioned, they are incredibly partisan. Nate, don't be fooled. It's not goodwill or cooperation, or they like you. They were able to achieve an end as a result of what they did with you. And I'm shocked to heavens I haven't won the Congeniality Award. Marilyn's excellent, though, just because of my consistent efforts in being positive and congenial compared to my colleagues. So I'm saying I have a hard time thinking in these abstracts that are not the current realities. I think there is good that can be found, but it is as a result of common strategy and a place where values intersect. Certainly presently, Brian, not a result of goodwill.
And to be fair, I think, again, in the system in which we live, where you ultimately are seeking to achieve a majority government through a first past the post system, then you are likely to have that interplay. Although I will say that relationships do matter, and over time, like I can comfortably say I'm not out to burn unfairly, at least, colleagues from across the aisle in a way that our partisanship does, I think, encourage us to do, unfortunately, at times. And so I think we do have to pause sometimes and just make sure that we are conducting ourselves in a way that is not to suggest we're all part of the same party and we're not to hold each other accountable for our actions, but that isn't out to sort of take cheap shots, and is out to.
But don't be so naive as to think you're not being manipulated.
Yeah, fair.
Very good.
I think Pierre Poilievre is a pussycat, and he's very, very sweet to me. So I don't know what you're talking about, Stephanie.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. This question, I think, was touched on a little bit by Elizabeth during her comments when she saw it. It's from Thomas. Just want to see if there maybe be some more threads we can pull from it. Thomas asks, says, I think Elizabeth makes fantastic points on the power of the PMO and especially party discipline in our parliament. But the situation vis-a-vis party discipline seems to be much healthier and more open in other similar Westminster common law jurisdictions, such as the UK and Australia. What's the matter with Canada? So I guess there's a bunch of ways you can go with this. But what's the matter with Canada compared to these other places when it comes to party disciplines being so tight? What do you think, Stephanie? Or is it a problem at all?
Again, I struggle because I really don't know any other way. I struggle more that it's not merit-based. Yeah, two things. One, that it's not merit-based. I'm astounded that I'm not even going to get into it. It's not merit-based. And secondly, being a team player is severely undervalued in our system. There's no benefit, not internally within your caucus, to build hardly any. And externally, no, there's not either. I've thought about it a lot. Yeah, those sort of would be my closing thoughts. Yeah, I'm sorry I sound so incredibly negative and pessimistic because I generally am a really positive person. Ask my family and my friends. But this place has really challenged me in the last 4 years because it can steal your sunshine, and it's a result of everything we talked about here today with the PMO, but within your own party as well. So I think the questions that we're getting are and the idea, it's great to have ideas, and it's very, I think, important always to strive to be idealistic, but I'm also very grounded in the present and the reality of how things are.
Well, I'm just going to jump on that, Stephanie, because I've often thought about it, sitting through Parliament, particularly when we were all there together, and particularly nasty question periods, and thinking, this is the only workplace I can imagine where bullying is not only tolerated, it's celebrated. It's who gets ahead is the loudest bellower. And, on basis of merit and competence, you got all the stuff, right? For me, I think that working together across party lines I had no choice. Deb Gray is also a friend of mine. I've always made friends across party lines. And I know the other parliamentarians made Deb Gray absolutely miserable when she was the first ever Reform Party MP. So, I really set out to make sure that I was making friends across party lines, that I could make a difference across party lines. But the reality of it is that party discipline, I think, is antithetical to democracy. You get better decisions with more heads functioning, more people talking. And I really am attracted to John Ralston Saul's idea in A Fairer Country, that as Canadians, we, by osmosis, perhaps, culturally absorbed notions of Indigenous culture, consensus decision-making, that we could all be in a circle and try to figure things out together. And I still think Parliament can be more of that if we reduced the power and oppressiveness of party, and I take your point, Nate, they're just not party whips, they do have direct instructions from PMO, but reduce the presence of partisanship and party political strategies for the next election in the way we form legislation and the way we debate issues and the way we try to come to good decisions for Canadians.
I suppose I would say it's not a process that happens overnight, but it has been happening in a serious way, not a perfect way, since 2015. I certainly am able to vote freely. It's not always been the easiest thing in the world, but I have voted differently on a number of different occasions, and I continue to do so. And so I'm not going to be a minister, I don't think, anytime soon. So being a team player probably does come with some benefits, Stephanie. But I do think when we look at the way committees function, they are not perfect, but they're far more independent than they were before I got there in 2015, from everyone I speak to. When we look at the way that individual MPs are given a little bit more latitude, at least my understanding in our caucus, I do think there is a push towards reducing some of that centralization in some regards, but keep in mind there are challenges to this too. I think one answer to the question is really competent ministers, right? If you had really competent ministers with really competent staff that would fall on the sword when they fucked up, then yeah, the PMO probably wouldn't need to be involved in every single decision. But if you don't have that level of competency and trust across cabinet, then it's this constant challenge of reaching in to make sure decisions are made and then bottlenecking yourself because you're involved in too many decisions. And so there's no perfect answer probably in the UK in terms of freer votes. I think, as I say, the size probably matters too. It's easier in a smaller caucus to wag your finger at one another. But I do think we are taking steps, but we just have to build on it. And lastly, although I appreciate Stephanie's pushback on idealism, I would say in the end, you do have to conduct yourself the way you want the place to be. And so if we as a collective want the Prime Minister's office to have less power, then we should act like that. And then guess what? They would have less power because they wouldn't be able to exert that power over us in quite the same way. So I do think that kind of cultural change is where I would return to, is if we act the way we want it to be, then it'll quickly become that place. Wonderful.
Well, time flies. That was well said. Thank you, Nate. Time flies, and we're already at the end of time. I just want to say, Stephanie, Nathaniel, Elizabeth, it was, from my perspective, a pleasure. And in terms of, I leave this conversation with a lot of hope in terms of the future of Canadian parliamentary democracy, because I think if I were to go out on the street and say I just moderated or attended a panel with MPs from 3 different parties that was incredibly constructive, collegial, honest, transparent, I think first of all people would think I wouldn't believe that happened. So that to me says a lot about you. So thank you for being here, and really just grateful for your very thoughtful comments on this very important topic. I'm really grateful, and I'll hand it over to Mark to close us off.
Before you all go, I just have to say I want to thank the organizers of this event a lot. They may not thank themselves. So Brian was a great moderator, but I know Valerie and all the people at Hart House and the Runnymede Society worked really hard on this. So I just wanted to thank you, because also, as you can see, Nate and Stephanie and I needed a reunion. We might not be able to govern together, but we can party. We love each other.
I echo all that thanks. And next time it won't be mimosas, Stephanie. I'll bring the tequila.
Oh, I love it. Sounds good. No, sounds great. Thank you so much for having us.
Very good. I'll hand it over to Mark.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to the 3 of you for this discussion. Really in the best tradition of Runnymede, talking about issues that we don't often get to talk about in this country. So thank you so much.